At 2:58 a.m., the office was quiet enough to hear the hum of the ventilation and the faint ticking of a wall clock no one had noticed before. She stood by her desk, not rushing, not hesitating, just finishing something invisible to everyone else. Hours earlier, they had told her to be grateful, smiled, moved on. But numbers don't forget tone, and systems don't ignore patterns. By 3 o'clock, she was already gone. By 3:12, something inside the company had shifted, and no one in that room was ready to explain why. The meeting room still carried the aftertaste of polite applause. It had been one of those carefully staged corporate moments: neutral lighting, glass walls, identical chairs aligned with almost surgical precision. Everything looked controlled, measured, predictable, even the smiles, especially the smiles. She sat at the far end of the table when her name was called, not in the center, not where top performers usually sit, just slightly off, close enough to be seen, far enough to be managed. $4,500 bonus this quarter, HR announced with that rehearsed brightness. A pause. And we really appreciate your consistency. Consistency. The word landed softly, like a compliment that didn't quite want to commit. A few people nodded. Someone tapped lightly on the table as if that counted as applause. The kind of reaction that fills space but not meaning. She didn't respond immediately, not because she was surprised, because she was calculating. Across the table, someone else, newer, louder, recently promoted, was still receiving congratulations for a remarkable contribution. The number attached to that recognition had been mentioned earlier: $32,000. No one repeated it now. They didn't need to. Numbers like that echo on their own. She adjusted a pen on the table, straightened it so it aligned perfectly with the edge, a small, almost invisible act of control. Any questions? HR asked, scanning the room with a polite, detached curiosity. There it was. The moment. She could have asked, she could have smiled, she could have accepted the language of market alignment and internal benchmarks. Instead, she gave a small nod. No, she said, simple, clean, closed. Because questions, she understood, only matter when the answers are meant to change something. And nothing in that room was built to change. The meeting moved on instantly, as if her moment had already expired, as if her role had been completed the second the number was spoken. Slides advanced, voices overlapped, another topic replaced her entirely, but something subtle had already detached. Not visibly, not dramatically, just enough. By 11:47 p.m., the office looked different. The same glass walls now reflected emptiness instead of movement. The same lights felt colder, harsher without conversation to soften them. Desks that carried urgency during the day now looked like paused decisions. She was still there, not working in the frantic, performative way people often do when they want to be noticed. No rushed typing, no exaggerated focus, just precise actions. Folders opened, files reviewed, access logs checked, not obsessively, but methodically. She wasn't gathering anything she didn't already understand. She was confirming it. There's a difference. Her screen glowed in the dim office, casting a quiet reflection on the glass beside her. For a moment, it looked like there were two of her, one sitting, one observing. The observer looked calmer. At 12:26 a.m., she paused, not because she was tired, because the pattern was now complete. The numbers aligned too cleanly, not random, not situational, structured, deliberate, and once you see structure, you can't unsee it. She leaned back slightly, exhaling, not heavily, not dramatically, just enough to mark the shift from uncertainty to clarity. On another desk, someone had left a printed report, a summary of departmental allocations. She had glanced at it earlier, briefly. Now she didn't need to look again because she remembered the ratios. She always remembered the ratios. At 2:41 a.m., she closed the last file. No hesitation, no second pass. Everything that needed to be seen had been seen. Everything that needed to be understood was already settled. Around her, the office had gone completely still. Even the ventilation seemed quieter now, as if the building itself was holding its breath. She stood up slowly, not in a dramatic gesture, not as a statement, just finished. Her chair slid back with a soft sound that echoed more than it should have in an empty space. She looked around once, not nostalgically, not emotionally, objectively, glass, screens, clean lines, controlled environments, a system designed to look fair, and yet her gaze lingered for half a second longer than necessary on the conference room door. That same room, that same table, that same word, consistency. A faint smile appeared. Not warm, not bitter, accurate, consistent, she repeated quietly, as if testing the weight of it. Then she reached for her bag. At exactly 3 a.m., she walked out. No announcement, no message left behind, no visible disruption. The door closed softly. The system remained intact, at least on the surface, because some changes don't happen when people speak. They happen when the right person stops participating. And somewhere deep inside a system built on numbers, something had already started recalculating. It just hadn't reached the visible layer yet. But it would very soon. At 3:07 a.m., the system didn't break. It adjusted quietly, precisely, without emotion. Somewhere in the company's internal analytics layer, far from meeting rooms and polished conversations, an automated report finished recalculating compensation distributions. It wasn't designed to judge. It didn't care about tone or smiles or carefully chosen words like consistency. It cared about patterns. And patterns, unlike people, don't hesitate. At 3:09 a.m., a notification appeared in the CFO's dashboard queue. Not urgent, not yet. Just another flagged anomaly. But anomalies at that level don't stay quiet for long. The system had detected a variance, subtle at first glance, but statistically loud. Compensation ratios inside one team had shifted beyond acceptable thresholds, not dramatically, not illegally, just enough, enough to matter, enough to be noticed by something that doesn't get tired. At 3:12 a.m., the report opened. No one saw the exact moment, but inside that document, everything was already laid out with clinical clarity. Columns, names, numbers aligned with perfect indifference. And there it was, $4,500, $32,000, same quarter, same functional impact bracket, different outcomes. The difference wasn't just numerical, it was structural, a pattern repeating across multiple entries. Not identical, but consistent enough to draw a line through, a line no one had drawn in the meeting room. At 3:14 a.m., the system added context, performance scores, tenure, project weight. Each layer didn't dilute the discrepancy, it sharpened it. Because once you normalize the data, excuses disappear, and what remains is intent, or something that looks very close to it. Back in the empty office, nothing moved. Her desk was clean, her screen was dark, no trace of urgency, no sign of protest, just absence. And absence in the right place has a way of amplifying everything around it. At 3:18 a.m., a secondary flag appeared. This one carried more weight. Escalation recommended, not because of a single number, but because of trajectory. The system doesn't just look at what happened, it models what happens next. And what it saw wasn't stable. If left untouched, the variance would widen quietly, predictably, until it reached a threshold where it would no longer be a data issue, but a reputational one. Internal first, external later. At 3:21 a.m., something subtle shifted in priority levels. The report moved up, not dramatically, just enough to land closer to morning attention. Because risk in corporate environments rarely explodes, it accumulates. Across the city, the building remained silent. No alarms, no calls, no visible consequences, just a recalculation in progress, and somewhere inside that recalculation, a missing variable, her. By 3:26 a.m., the system attempted to simulate future adjustments. Retention probability dropped. Team dependency metrics adjusted downward. Knowledge distribution flagged as uneven, not catastrophic, but fragile. Fragile systems don't fail immediately. They fail when pressure arrives, and pressure, like patterns, is predictable. At 3:30 a.m., the report finalized. Clean, structured, impossible to ignore once opened, but still unopened by human eyes. For now, because the most dangerous moment in any system isn't when the problem appears, it's the gap between detection and awareness. Somewhere between those minutes, something irreversible had already happened. Not the gap itself, but the understanding of it. She had seen it hours earlier, understood it without needing confirmation, and chosen her response without raising her voice. No confrontation, no escalation, no visible resistance, just alignment with reality. Back in the meeting room, hours before, they had used the word grateful, a soft word, a safe word, but systems don't measure gratitude, they measure imbalance. And imbalance, once documented, becomes something else entirely. By the time the first employee would walk into that office in the morning, the environment would look unchanged. Same lights, same desks, same carefully controlled atmosphere. But beneath that surface, the structure had already begun to shift because one variable had been removed, and the system had noticed. The only question left was how fast everyone else would, and what they would do once they did. If you've ever been told to be grateful while something didn't feel right, pause for a second. Because sometimes the most important shift doesn't happen when you argue. It happens when you quietly see the pattern and decide what you're no longer part of. If this story feels familiar, stay with it. Because what happens next isn't louder, it's sharper. And once the system fully catches up, there's no going back. At 8:42 a.m., the office returned to life. Lights didn't change, but energy did. Conversations resumed in fragments. Coffee machines clicked into routine. Screens lit up one by one like a controlled ignition of another workday. Everything looked familiar, predictable, functional, and yet something subtle resisted alignment. At 8:47 a.m., her absence was first registered not as a concern, but as a delay. She's probably working remotely, someone said without looking up. A reasonable assumption, comfortable, convenient, because absence is easiest to explain when you don't look too closely. At 8:52 a.m., HR opened their dashboard. Notifications stacked in quiet layers. Most were routine, approvals, confirmations, minor adjustments. Then the report. It didn't announce itself, it didn't flash, it just sat there, structured and waiting. For a moment, it was ignored because structured problems don't feel urgent until you read them. At 8:56 a.m., it was opened. The room didn't change, but the interpretation of it did. Columns, names, numbers, and then alignment, or rather, the lack of it. $4,500, $32,000, placed side by side, stripped of context that used to soften the difference. Now just data, unfiltered, unnegotiated. At 9:01 a.m., HR leaned back slightly, not dramatically, not visibly, just enough to create distance between themselves and the screen, because the screen wasn't asking a question, it was presenting a conclusion. At 9:03 a.m., a second tab opened. Performance scores, the usual defense. Metrics often justify decisions, reshape them even, but here they didn't. If anything, they tightened the discrepancy because consistency, real consistency, doesn't produce gaps like that. Not repeatedly, not cleanly. At 9:06 a.m., something unspoken entered the room. Not panic, not yet. Recognition. The kind that doesn't come with sound but with a shift in posture, in breathing, in the way someone reads the same line twice. Across the floor, conversations continued. Someone laughed near the coffee machine. Someone complained about a deadline. Someone opened a presentation that would never reference this moment. Because most systems continue functioning, even when something inside them is already misaligned. At 9:11 a.m., her name appeared in a different context. Access logs, last activity, 2:41 a.m., system exit, 3 a.m., no anomalies, no irregularities, just a clean departure, too clean. At 9:14 a.m., HR checked internal communication threads. No message, no escalation, no complaint, nothing that could be categorized, filed, or responded to. Just absence. And absence without narrative is difficult to manage because you can't respond to what wasn't said. At 9:18 a.m., the report was reopened, this time slower, not scanning, reading, because now it wasn't just data, it was exposure, not public, not yet, but internal exposure is where structural risk begins. At 9:22 a.m., the phrase appeared again. Escalation recommended, no longer theoretical, now contextual, because the system had already done its part. It had measured, compared, projected. What remained was decision. Across the corridor, someone finally asked, "Has anyone seen her today?" A simple question, light tone, no urgency, but questions like that don't stay light for long. At 9:27 a.m., her desk was noticed. Not messy, not abandoned, just complete, as if the workday had ended exactly where it should, except it hadn't. At 9:31 a.m., the CFO's calendar shifted, a small adjustment, barely visible to anyone else, but enough to create space, because reports like that don't wait indefinitely, and neither do the implications behind them. Back in the meeting room from yesterday, everything looked the same. Same table, same chairs, same controlled environment. But meaning doesn't stay where it was left. It moves, reframes, returns differently. At 9:36 a.m., HR closed the report. Not because it was resolved, because it was understood. And understanding at that level is rarely comfortable. Somewhere between the numbers and the silence, a quiet realization settled in. This wasn't about a bonus. It was about a system that had just revealed itself without noise, without confrontation, just clarity. And clarity changes things, not immediately, not visibly, but inevitably. By the time the first formal conversation about it would begin, one fact would already be impossible to ignore. She hadn't reacted. She had responded, and the system was now doing the same. The only question left was whether they would adjust or try to explain something that no longer needed explanation. And explanations, like numbers, don't always hold under pressure. At 9:42 a.m., the first call was scheduled, not labeled as urgent, not framed as a problem, just a quick sink. Because in corporate language, the more precise the issue, the softer the label. At 9:47 a.m., the CFO opened the report. No rush, no visible reaction, just a controlled intake of information. He didn't start with the numbers, he started with the structure, because numbers can be explained. Structure is harder to defend. At 9:49 a.m., he filtered the data, quarter, department, performance tier, everything aligned too cleanly, too consistently, which in itself was the signal. Randomness leaves noise. This didn't. At 9:52 a.m., he isolated her row, not because it was the lowest, because it was the anchor, the point around which everything else started to make sense. $4,500. Placed against the system's own logic, it didn't fit, not as an exception, as a contradiction. At 9:55 a.m., he didn't ask, "Why is this low?" He asked something sharper. "What does this imply if it's intentional?" The room didn't answer, because the question wasn't looking for words, it was testing the boundary of risk. At 9:58 a.m., HR began to speak. Carefully, measured phrases, familiar language, context, internal calibration, market positioning, each word technically correct, each one insufficient, because context works when it explains variation, not when it repeats. At 10:02 a.m., the CFO didn't interrupt. He let the explanation complete itself, not out of politeness, out of precision, because incomplete explanations are easy to dismiss. Complete ones expose their own limits. At 10:05 a.m., he shifted the frame. Show me the distribution over time. Not today, not this quarter. Time, because patterns need duration to become undeniable. At 10:08 a.m., the graph loaded, clean lines, gradual divergence, nothing dramatic until you zoomed out. And then it was obvious. At 10:11 a.m., silence settled, not the empty kind, the analytical kind, the kind where everyone in the room understands the same thing at the same time. At 10:13 a.m., he asked the second question, "Who reviewed this?" Not accusatory, structural, because systems don't fail alone. They fail through layers. Names appeared, processes, approvals, sign offs. Everything had been followed, technically, and that was the problem. At 10:16 a.m., the realization sharpened. The system hadn't been bypassed, it had been used exactly as designed, and still, this happened. At 10:18 a.m., he leaned back slightly, not disengaging, reframing, because now this wasn't about one decision. It was about exposure, internal first, external, if left unresolved. Across the office, the day continued. Emails sent, meetings started, deadlines moved. No one outside that room knew the weight of what had just surfaced, because critical moments rarely announce themselves. They accumulate behind closed doors. At 10:21 a.m., someone finally said it. Is this a risk? A simple question, but imprecise. At 10:22 a.m., the CFO answered, "Yes, no qualifiers, no hesitation, because risk doesn't need adjectives when it's measurable." At 10:24 a.m., the next step wasn't debated. It was implied. Correction, but correction has layers: adjustment, communication, containment, each one with its own cost. At 10:27 a.m., another absence became visible. She hasn't logged in. This time, it didn't sound casual. At 10:29 a.m., HR checked again. No message, no request, no signal, just the same clean exit. At 10:31 a.m., the situation shifted, not because of what was said, because of what couldn't be controlled anymore. Narrative, because once a pattern exists, It only takes one perspective for it to become a story, and stories don't stay internal for long. At 10:34 a.m., the CFO closed the report, not to end the discussion, but to move it. Because data had done its job, now came response. He didn't raise his voice, didn't assign blame, didn't escalate theatrically. He just said, fix the structure, not the number, the structure. Because adjusting one line item changes optics, adjusting structure changes outcomes. At 10:37 a.m., the room understood the difference and the cost. Somewhere beyond that building, she was already outside the system, not reacting, not waiting, not negotiating. And that changed everything because systems are built to manage participants, not absences. By the time they would try to correct the imbalance, the original variable, the one that made the pattern visible, was already gone. And without it, every adjustment would carry a question. Was it fixed or just noticed? The answer wouldn't be immediate, but it would surface. Just like everything else in that system eventually did. And when it did, silence wouldn't be enough to contain it. At 10:42 a.m., the correction process began, not publicly, not visibly, inside spreadsheets, inside controlled conversations, inside carefully worded emails that never use the word problem. Because problems suggest mistakes, and this had followed the rules. At 10:47 a.m., HR initiated a recalibration draft. New ranges, adjusted ratios, soft language designed to look like evolution, not reaction. Alignment update, compensation harmonization, internal equity refinement, each phrase precise, each one slightly late. At 10:51 a.m., the CFO reviewed the proposal. He didn't look for improvement, he looked for exposure, because correction, if done too fast, creates its own pattern, and patterns, once visible, invite questions. At 10:54 a.m., he paused on one line. Retroactive adjustment, a clean solution, on paper. But paper doesn't hold memory the way people do, and memory doesn't recalibrate on command. At 10:58 a.m., he closed the draft. Not enough. Two words, calm, final. Because fixing numbers doesn't fix perception, and perception, once formed, becomes a second system, harder to control, impossible to rewrite. Across the office, subtle shifts had already started. Conversations that used to be casual became measured. People didn't say anything directly, but they noticed. They always do. The tone, the timing, the absence. At 11:03 a.m., someone mentioned her name again, this time not as a question, as a reference. She handled that project alone, right? A pause followed, short but heavy, because once recognition appears after absence, it changes meaning. At 11:07 a.m., another voice added quietly, and the rollout metrics were hers. No one confirmed, no one denied. They didn't need to, because clarity doesn't always require agreement. At 11:11 a.m., the system attempted to stabilize. Meetings were held. Adjustments discussed, language refined, but something fundamental had shifted, not in policy, in awareness. At 11:16 a.m., HR prepared a communication draft. Careful tone, balanced phrasing, no admissions, just forward-looking clarity, because in corporate environments, the future is often used to soften the past. At 11:19 a.m., the CFO read it once, then again, then closed it. Too early, because communication without control creates narrative, and narrative once outside no longer belongs to the system. At 11:23 a.m., the realization settled deeper. This wasn't a correction cycle, it was a containment phase. Across the floor, productivity looked normal, screens filled, Calls continued, deadlines approached, but underneath, a quiet recalibration of trust. At 11:28 a.m., her workstation was reassigned, not officially, just practically. A small shift, efficient, necessary, and yet symbolic, because systems move forward by replacing variables, but replacement isn't the same as equivalence. At 11:31 a.m., a new question surfaced, unspoken, unwritten, but present in every glance toward the numbers. How many times has this happened before? Unnoticed? No one answered, because the answer, if pursued, wouldn't stop at one case. At 11:36 a.m., the CFO reopened the report, not to reanalyze, to confirm. Everything was still there, clear, structured, undeniable. The system had done its job perfectly. It had revealed the truth, late but not too late. At 11:40 a.m., he gave the final directive. Document everything, not for now, for later, because risk doesn't disappear when addressed. It transforms into record, into precedent, into something that can be referenced when it matters most. Outside the building, the day was already in motion. Traffic, noise, movement, normal life. She was part of that now, not inside the structure, not inside the system, just outside. And outside, things are simpler. No calibrated language, no structured explanations, no controlled narratives, just clarity. Back inside, the system continued adjusting, carefully, quietly, precisely, but one variable remained unresolved, not the numbers, not the process, the absence. Because absence doesn't argue, it doesn't escalate, it doesn't demand, it just reveals. By the end of the day, the structure would look improved, balanced, corrected, stable on paper. But beneath that, a memory would remain of a moment when everything worked exactly as designed and still exposed something no one planned to see. And that memory wouldn't be erased by silence. It would sit there, like a number in a report, waiting until the next time someone looked closely enough or decided not to be part of it at all.